Lone Rider here. I just got back from a bike ride, and I just wanted to share something with you about road safety, and in particular the concept of self-driving cars that occurred to me while I was out riding. And I've been thinking about this since I read something last night, in particular. Now, you may not be familiar with the concept. It sounds sort of like something out of Star Trek or whatever, but there's a general belief that autonomous vehicles are going to be coming to the roads of America and most of the rest of the world at some point in the near future. And many companies, such as Google and Uber and Tesla and people like that, are trying really, really, really hard to push this as the next big thing since sliced cheese. Now, my problem, of course, is very obvious. Being a cyclist, is that I honestly don't think this is a good idea for us. I don't think that there's going to be enough consideration taken to account for cyclists. I think that these things are going to be just as dangerous as their human counterparts, if not more so. Perhaps not in the same ways, but ultimately I think the danger is going to remain the same or maybe even increase. And I also have a philosophical issue with the concept of a machine that doesn't understand the concept of life being put in a position of being able to take life. Even in a war zone where most of the people you encounter in enemy territory are going to be enemies, there might be non-combatants, but they're among the side of the enemy. We still don't allow machines to make the decision on whether or not to, let's say, drop a bomb or fire a missile. We have remote controlled and otherwise unmanned vehicles, in particular aircraft, that are used in war for surveillance and for obviously for targeting as well with weapons. But at the end of the day, there's a pilot on the ground, maybe not in the airplane, but on the ground, and a chain of command, and somebody has to take human responsibility for pushing that button or pulling that trigger. So even in a war zone where most of the people you encounter are going to be the enemy, you still have that precaution of, at the end of the chain of events, there's a human being who has to make the decision to take a life. So amongst our own civilians, these guys want to put robots, or basically computer algorithms, in a position of making that decision. I call no way. I call law of unintended consequences. I call this can end badly. Now, that's not to say that as an ideal, as a concept, there might not be some benefit to self-driving cars in some circumstances. For example, if you have somebody who gets too drunk and there's nobody available to drive him home, if his car was capable of just sedately putting along and driving him home without hitting anything better than he would be in his inebriated condition, it's certainly advantageous. You've saved a life there, his or someone else's, potentially. Similarly, if you have a car that's capable of taking control and pulling the car over to the road and stopping safely without hitting anything, if the driver, let's say, has a heart attack or a stroke or something, or a seizure, that, again, you could potentially save somebody's life. But even there, the degree of what you're talking about, with the drunk example, you're talking about a car that can drive itself home, essentially, from the bar. But with the vehicle being able to simply pull over and stop without hitting anything, if the driver becomes incapacitated, that's very different than being able to drive itself, to a destination or something. We're simply talking about a fail-safe where the vehicle simply makes sure the way is clear, pulls over and stops and puts on its flashers. Kind of like positive train control in that sense. There's a difference between an automatic braking mechanism as a fail-safe if the driver becomes incapacitated or dies. So the thing doesn't, let's say, plow into a bicyclist or an old lady crossing the street or a carload of nuns or something, right? Kill a family of four. There's a very big difference between that and saying we want the car to be able to run errands by itself and drive me to work while I'm in the back seat playing Xbox. Seriously, one, you're talking about a fail-safe that does a very small thing in a very small situation. The other thing, you're talking about a substitute for the human eye, the human brain, all sorts of stuff that scientists will tell you we can't even explain how it works yet in many ways. And yet, we're going to try and duplicate that. Well, you can't, because you don't know how it works in detail. We know more than we did 10, 20, 30, 100 years ago, but we still aren't there yet. So all we can do is approximate. So if the goal of the self-driving car is to create a car that can do essentially the same thing as a human driver, you're never going to be able to do that. What you can do is try and create a car that's going to approximate the result that a human driver could do, but without doing the same thing. Because to do that, you would need to create fully sentient artificial intelligence. And something tells me if they ever do that, I mean, maybe they haven't, it's secret, but if they ever do that, I doubt it's going to be incorporated into a mundane consumer product that every Tom, Dick, and Harry has parked in their garage. Somehow I just don't see that happening. Maybe it would. I'm not sure which is scarier, that something like that gets invented and kept secret, or that something like that becomes incorporated into cars and toasters and whatever. But nevertheless, even the idea itself of creating a self-driving car, well, since we don't have sentient computers in the sense of a human brain, well, what are you doing? You're not trying to duplicate the same thing. You're trying to take a shortcut. You're trying to get it to do what amounts to the same thing by a different process. It has to be a different process because it's not sentient. Here's my problem with this whole thing. What you end up with is you're putting a machine in a position of taking a human life. And I'm trying to wrap my mind around why anybody would think that's a good idea. Again, we don't even use that in war zones amongst the enemy. You want to use that kind of a process on our civilian streets, here among other Americans? Like, what are you thinking? Now, I understand why this idea is finding purchase among some people. Futurists, for example, if we can call them that charitably, who see this as, like, again, the greatest thing since sliced cheese. They just sort of see this as a harmless, happy thing, I see a lot of potential downsides. Assuming, let me put it this way, even if the cars can drive safely around other cars, both humans that are driving and their own self-driving kind. So even if it can safely react with regular drivers and other self-driving cars, I still see a lot of problems. And it's a big if that we even get to that point, because there have been a lot of problems with these things crashing and so on and so forth. A lot of times they try to blame people. They'll say, well, the car wasn't fully autonomous. It was only semi-autonomous, so the driver should have still paid attention. Really? Then how come you called the so-called semi-autonomous feature autopilot? I mean, if the driver wasn't paying attention, isn't it because your marketing has convinced him that it's not necessary? If the driver wasn't paying attention, isn't it because you're pushing the idea that the ultimate goal of all this technology is for drivers not to have to pay attention? I mean, it's kind of disingenuous to constantly push the idea of a self-driving car, and then when you have technology that's like halfway or 3/4 of the way there, to blame the human when it crashes for using and depending on that self-driving technology. It's also disingenuous when the cars are driving erratically in traffic because they can't drive smoothly, because they can't react to things the way a normal person can, because they're not sentient, and that basically the technology isn't ready for this yet. When they stop and start erratically in traffic, causing them to get rear-ended, yes, technically rear-ending another car is your fault, but you're also ignoring the fact that if that robot car hadn't been there driving erratically, it would never have gotten rear-ended. So while legally you can say, yes, it's the fault of the person who rear-ended it, as an actual fact in the real world, the legal fact is rear-ending another car, you're usually responsible unless you can prove it did something really unusual, like the brake lights weren't working or whatever. Yes, as a rule, generally speaking, the default assumption legally is that if you rear-end another car, it's your fault. Here's the thing. What if that car was driving erratically? Well, wouldn't that be then a percentage of the blame? You could always argue you could have left more following distance. You could have left more following distance. A lot of people don't leave enough following distance. But also, at some point, if you leave enough following distance, you're 30 car lengths behind at some point you have to you have to have some common sense here. You can't just say, well, you should have done more to avoid it, especially since what you're being counted on to avoid is something that nobody's ever seen before. This is a new invention. Prior to this period in history, we never had the concept of cars driving themselves and robots behind the wheel. So to then blame other people for not knowing how to react to them when they drive differently from human drivers, which has been the default up to this point, is kind of disingenuous. Again, maybe these people weren't paying attention. Maybe they were following too close. Who knows? We know that, generally speaking, the assumption if you rear-end a car is that you were, in fact, at fault. However, it's also true that if those robot cars hadn't been there would have been nobody to rear-end. Now maybe the collision would have happened with another car driven by a human because the person behind was, in fact, following too close or distracted or whatever. We don't know. That's a maybe. You can never prove what never happened. All we can say is that the collision did occur between a robot car and a human driver. And when you look at how often these things get rear-ended and hit, and one even got pulled over by a policeman because it was driving so slow it was causing a traffic jam behind it. Why was it driving so slow? It couldn't handle the normal situation on the road. So the default programming was, if you can't understand what's going on, just go slower to try and limit the damage if you hit something. And I have to at least give a grudging respect to companies like Google and stuff like that had speed limiters on their cars. They couldn't go faster than, let's say, 25 miles an hour. Okay, at least on one hand, they're trying to have some concern for the safety of the populace. On the other hand, that type of concern would be totally fracking unnecessary if you weren't using the public street as a gosh darn laboratory and we weren't all your lab rats and guinea pigs, right? Not for nothing. And secondly, there is a problem with limiting the speed of these things, as you saw with the police car. The policeman that pulled the car over, only to find there was no driver because it was essentially obstructing traffic and creating a backup behind it and a dangerous congestion. Is that if you have somebody driving 25 in a 25, that's fine. That's what you're supposed to do. But these cars weren't just driving on streets with 25-mile-an-hour speed limits. They were driving on other streets as well. Streets where the speed limit might be 40 or 45. Well, if the posted speed on a street is 40 and you're doing 25, unless it's like snowing or something, the logical person is going to look at that and say, that person must be drunk or something. Why else would they be going that slow? I could see maybe going 5 miles under the speed, the posted speed, but to go 20 and in a 40 and a 25 and a 45, unless you're drunk, you're in the middle of having a seizure or something, or you're like seriously distracted by some kind of texting or whatever it is you're doing, which is illegal, by the way. In other words, if you're paying attention and you're driving safely, there's no reason for you to be going that slow, just like there's no reason for you to be going dramatically faster than the posted speed. The danger it creates is of a different kind, but it still creates a danger. Everybody's pretty much aware that going too fast can be dangerous. But what happens when you have somebody going really, really that much slower? Well, first of all, it creates a whole bunch of variables that didn't previously exist. They trap people behind them, thereby creating automobile congestion, thereby creating a whole bunch of variables for that section of street that previously wouldn't be there, and that the street's not intended to deal with in terms of the volume of traffic. Now, they're going slower, so generally speaking, if a car hits another car at 20 miles an hour, the people inside are probably safer than if they get into a collision at 40. But cars aren't the only thing on the roads, guys. There's dudes biking, crossing the street, whatever. What about us? Yeah, we get goat fucked, right? And if you're on a motorcycle, same thing. You're out of luck. So the very fact, on one hand, that they put limits on the speed, yeah, on one hand, it's like, well, okay, props for them. They're looking out for safety. They're trying to at least make sure that their cars do less damage if they do crash. However, at the same time, those limits then mean those cars should really only be driven on streets that have speed limits 25 miles an hour or less, which means what? Well, they should really have been trucking them out on flatbeds to residential neighborhoods to test them. They shouldn't have been allowing them to drive through regular streets. That was creating a lot of problems. But again, even the residential neighborhoods, okay, it's capable of keeping up with the prevailing speed of traffic, posted 25 miles an hour. But why should the people in the residential neighborhood be made guinea pigs of any more than the people on the main road? At least on one hand, okay, it's not going to cause a 2 mile long traffic backup, but you're still putting it in a situation where it could hurt somebody because it's not ready. Okay, it's not ready. In fact, I could argue that testing it in a residential neighborhood or a downtown, a place that does have, let's say, a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit usually, um, it might actually be more dangerous because that's where you're more likely to encounter people on bikes, people walking, etc. More variables than a highway or a main county road. And what happens there? Well, then the shortcomings of the cars come to the fore. When they first started talking about these, everybody and their brother was like, oh, they're going to be so much safer than regular cars. And a lot of cyclists in particular were like, oh, this is the answer to the texting driver, the drunk driver, the driver, with the road rage, or the asshole that doesn't know how to use a turn signal. Well, the computer's never going to make all those mistakes. It's going to be a boon for mankind. And there were a lot of cyclists who, when the idea first came out, were like, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to be so much safer. But the computer companies and the car companies and the government industry, who've kind of joined in this, axis of self-driving cars, and of course the media as well. So I don't know if we can call it an axis if there's four parts, but this cabal, if you will, all working together. And I don't think it's some kind of conspiracy. I honestly think they all just have their own self-serving goals. I mean, the companies probably have dreams of, marketing targeted internet ads to passengers trapped inside their self-driving cars during their commute. The government probably likes the idea because it means more regimentation for society, and they're going to know where everybody is at every time, either directly if they're the ones monitoring the things and running the system, or indirectly through some big company like Google or Uber or Tesla or Skynet. But and then the media, I don't know why the media support them. I honestly think there's just a tendency for the media to support what they think are noble sounding utopian ideas. And usually these ideas are absolutely terrible ideas once you scratch beneath the surface. But hey, they sound really good at first, right? I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. But for whatever reason, there's a lot of people behind this idea pushing it. And initially we saw cyclists were probably because they were told, hey, this is going to be safer than human drivers and do away with human error. Well, do you really think that the CEO of some company or people in the government really care all that much about the average person on the street, the average bicyclist that's endangered by a careless driver? Do you think they really care all that much about you, that they'd be willing to totally turn American society and American road networks upside down to try and make you a little bit safer? Something tells me that's not their priority. Now, what is? I have no idea. Again, I don't think it's some big conspiracy. I think it's just a bunch of petty little self-serving interests that all came together. But for whatever reason, everybody and their brother's pushing this idea. And yes, I do think there is some idealistic, if you want to call them futurists, guys who've seen too many episodes of Star Trek or Deep Space Nine, that really believe that this is the way to go, and it's going to be like a boon for everyone. They were pushing this idea, and cyclists in the beginning were like, we're going along with it. And they're like, yeah, it's going to be a lot safer. Then there was absolute silence, and nobody really bothered to explain how it was going to be safer, in particular for cyclists. We had an article in the New York Times a few years ago about a test town that was set up with fake streets and crosswalks and everything to try and test these cars, so like a proving ground for them. And in the entire 2-page article, there was not a single mention of how it would deal with cyclists. They mentioned crosswalks and pedestrians, but they didn't mention a single thing about cyclists. And I got to sit there and say to myself, why? Well, obviously because they weren't testing for it. I mean, if you think about it, in 2 pages, they had enough time to go over everything else, including stuff that didn't deal with other motor vehicles, and they went over how it would react to pedestrians, so why not also cyclists? I mean, a pedestrian isn't a car either, but they didn't include it. And if you think about it, cyclists are normally ignored. That's like the default. So, this isn't the first potential change to the road network that we're sort of getting ignored on. However, because cyclists usually aren't considered, and when they are considered, it's seen as odd or unusual, or like you're going out of your way to appeal to them or something. So if they had mentioned to the New York Times news article writer, oh, and we're also testing it to see how it avoids hitting cyclists, and we're doing this, this, and this, the New York Times people most assuredly would have written that down because it would have struck them as odd. It would have struck anybody who's not a cyclist as odd because they don't normally think of us at all. Whereas I mean, my first thought when I hear of self-driving cars is how like what's the safety implications for me driving around them? I mean, should I go out right now and invest in a magnet on the end of a stick so I can fry the damn thing if it gets too close and nearly hits me? And honestly, I can't be the only person having that thought. They've done surveys and it varies. Between 2/3 and half of the people surveyed usually have safety concerns about self-driving cars. Now, usually they're looking at it from the point of view of being a passenger in one. I will never be a passenger in a self-driving car. So, that never even arises. But what I am worried about is idiots who flock out and get them. If I'm riding my bike or driving or crossing the street, will that friggin' thing kill me? And you know what? Here's something to throw out there, just as an aside. If it does kill you, what happens? Right now, we have a legal system based on responsibility for your actions. Yes, it's not enforced enough. Yes, people get away with what's essentially manslaughter and murder. All of those car crashes that are due to human error, a lot of them involving breaking the law or doing something you specifically shouldn't be doing. As a cyclist, this is not news to me, okay? I mean, I've had myself, my friends, other people I know who ride, get hit, and the driver, who usually is either drunk or talking on the phone or just doesn't know how to fucking drive, usually gets off scot-free. All they got to do is say, oh, I didn't see it. Well, if I applied that logic when I was at the archery range shooting my bow, if I was being careless and I just shot someone in the face, and I didn't see where I was pointing my bow, officer, you think that would fly? You think that would be an excuse? Hell no. I'm going to prison for manslaughter if I do that. All right? For some reason, a car, which weighs a hell of a lot more than a friggin' arrow or a bullet, we just tolerate this kind of insipid stupidity behind the wheel. And I think there's an acknowledgement even among drivers who, for some reason, don't seem to realize how dangerous they are compared to bicyclists or motorcyclists. They might bitch and moan about what they think are cyclists who are not obeying the rules or whatever. Usually they don't know what they're talking about because they're not a cyclist. I mean, I've had people yell at me, well, you can't ride alongside cars. But then when they want to pass me, they're like, why don't you get over so I can drive alongside you? Hello, McFly, anybody home? And of course, you read the vehicle code. It talks about passing cars on the left, but it also talks about riding to the right of them. And where it does so, it also includes exercising due care while passing a standing or moving vehicle proceeding in the same direction. Translation, in plain vernacular, you could pass on the left or the right in a bicycle, depending on the context. Whatever. A lot of drivers don't know jack shit about cycling, so I'm not surprised that they nitpick things they don't understand. But the point is, it's kind of funny. You have the average driver who's complaining about what somebody on a 20-pound bicycle may or may not be doing. And even assuming they're completely right and that particular bicycle is an arsehole, you're doing the same thing behind the wheel of a car that weighs 2,000 pounds and is powered by a series of small controlled explosions. So, Pot, this is Kettle. I'm contacting you and concerning your hue. Yeah, hypocrisy. But I think despite the hypocrisy, the drivers have enough cognizance of the fact that many of them are dangerous to each other and to bicyclists and pedestrians and motorcyclists, etc., that they realize that this is a safety issue. So when people who want to push the idea of self-driving cars throw out there, well, hey, this will eliminate human error, a lot of people are like, well, yeah, that's going to make it safer, because they know even if they, give crap to cyclists and, when it's cyclists and cars back and forth, the drivers are always like, no, drivers are perfect. We never do anything wrong, says the guy who just ran a stop sign while talking on the phone and lighting a cigarette while steering with his knee and sipping some Jim Beam bourbon. Yeah. Whatever. People are assholes. But it's because people know that people are assholes, even though a lot of times they try to stick up for their side and denounce the bikes. Oh, drivers aren't so bad, but we all know drivers are bad. And I think they're banking on that when they try to push self-driving cars as a safety improvement. It's going to eliminate human error. Even if it did, you're still left with the question of how safe will it be? And, we can't build a car that can replicate the human brain. So what you're going to do is essentially just have programming. So it's limited by its programming. If it encounters something that it's not programmed to deal with, it won't be able to deal with it. And in the beginning, a lot of cyclists were going along with everybody else and saying, oh, this is great. This is going to be a boon. Then you started to see about a year, 2 years ago maybe, people raising questions about, well, how are they dealing with cyclists? We know Google was testing its self-driving cars on the public streets for years before they even bothered to address the subject of how they were going to safely interact with cyclists. And they still haven't addressed it satisfactorily. What they did is they showed a computer-animated model of a single car interacting with a single cyclist on an open road in clear weather with no other variables around. Yeah, that doesn't reassure. Show me the actual car interacting with a cyclist on a crowded street or in bad weather or with other cars around or other pedestrians around or other bicyclists around, or the cyclist is riding at the edge of a lane, but it's a multiple lane road, so he's between the cars. Show me the self-driving car safely reacting to the cyclist then. Yeah. They don't do it. They don't do it. And when you raise questions of, well, something like years ago, I saw that article in the New York Times and I said, look, here's an entire 2-page article on building a fake test town, and they didn't include a single mention of cyclists. Now, cycling is so odd that I think if they had mentioned they were, to non-cyclists it's odd anyway, that if they had mentioned they were putting something about cyclists in there, I'm sure it would have been put in the article, just because it was odd. And secondly, with a 2-page article, you really have the space to put in everything they're doing. And they did put in non-car stuff. They talked about how it was being trained to look for pedestrians and crosswalks. So why didn't they put anything about bicycles or even motorcycles? No answer, right? Well, I'm calling bullshit on this. I'm saying, look, self-driving car industry, if you really are trying to train your cars to deal with, teach your cars, program your cars, whatever you want to call it, to deal with traffic, well, we're part of traffic. So show us, tell us how you're programming or teaching or whatever these things to deal with bicyclists. And nobody has. Nobody has in any significant way. And we do know that for several of the semi-autonomous things out there, like the Tesla autopilot and Volvo's thing and stuff like that, that it will only react to the bicycle if it has a reflector and it's like directly in front of the car and so forth. So it can't see you from the side. So if you're at a cross street, it won't see you. If you're making a turn, whatever. And if you're riding off to the side, where a lot of cyclists normally ride, it won't see you. You have to be directly in front of the car. And you have to have a reflector, which is kind of stupid. I don't know about you. None of my bikes have reflectors because we have lights. In fact, we're required by law to have lights at night. And usually the space where you mount the light is the space where the reflector comes. So I take those off. And virtually every other cyclist I know does too. Sometimes if it's like a mountain bike or something and you have a long seat post, you might just leave it on and move it all the way down out of the way. But then will it be at the height where the thing's going to see it? It also said it has to be an adult-sized bike with the reflector at a certain height. So by the way, they're not only not programming it to look out for adult cyclists, they're not programming it to see kids on bikes. Now, maybe that might not be a problem. By the time these things become commonplace, maybe no kids will bike. Maybe they'll just sit in their room with their Xbox all day. A lot of them do that now already. But my problem is, okay, even if you don't like adult cyclists, even if you don't like mountain bikers or roadies, oh, you guys, you're a bunch of arseholes. I don't like you. You're taking out my streets, whatever. Whatever you think of us as cyclists. What about your kid, right? Do you want the self-driving cars to see your fracking kid when he's out there riding his kid's bike? They're not programming him to do that. That's not considered a priority. Since when is a species not looking out for the safety of its offspring a friggin' priority? Beyond basic human decency, I mean, this principle, if you applied it in other things, we would be extinct, okay? Looking out for your children shouldn't just be the right thing to do. I mean, I would argue it should be a biological imperative. And yet, no provision I guess maybe Volvo's looking to that future when every kid is 300 pounds and sits in their room playing Xbox and nobody rides a bicycle. Maybe.